August 1945. The war is lost, though no one dares say it aloud. Japan is a smoldering ruin, cities flattened, railways shattered, the air force erased from the sky. Yet in the mountains outside Nagano, far from the command centers and air raids, two figures stand beside something that should not exist. It is a plane, or rather, a collection of memories that can fly. The fuselage is scarred metal stitched with rivets of different sizes. Its wings don't quite match. Its engine cowling is pitted and uneven, welded by hand. Under the morning fog, it looks less like an aircraft and more like defiance given shape. The older man wipes oil from his hands. His name is Ryoichi Nakagawa, a junior engineer once employed by the Nakajima Aircraft Company, Japan's largest aircraft manufacturer. But Nakajima's factories have been obliterated by B-29s. The war has no use for engineers anymore, except this one never stopped building. Nakagawa had ignored orders, scavenged parts, and built an airplane from wreckage, a prototype fighter assembled illegally from the remains of 4 destroyed planes. Its bones are aluminum from crashed Kai-43 Oscars. Its heart, a stolen engine pulled from a wrecked Kai-84 Hayate. Its cockpit instruments were once part of a bomber that never made it home. To the Imperial bureaucracy, it's a crime. To Nakagawa, it's proof that Japan still has something left that works. He looks to the pilot, Lieutenant Masaru Takeda, a young test flyer with barely 20 hours of experience. Takeda's eyes are sunken, his uniform faded. There are no medals left to earn, no victory left to chase. But when Nakagawa asks him, "Will you fly it?" he nods. They roll the plane out of the hangar. The wheels creak over packed dirt. No one has told Tokyo. No permission was granted. The Imperial Code still forbids unauthorized tests, sabotage of war material punishable by death. But there is no war material left, only scraps and ghosts. The morning air is still. Nakagawa climbs onto the wing, checks the hand-carved propeller, and whispers a prayer to the metal. Takeda straps in. The engine coughs, belches smoke, then roars. The vibration shakes the ground. The little plane trembles but holds. Nakagawa steps back, shielding his eyes. Takeda throttles up, the makeshift airframe rattling like a drum. The tail lifts, the wheels bump, and then, impossibly, it rises. The sound changes, from sputtering defiance to the clean hum of flight. Nakagawa stares upward, unable to breathe. The plane climbs above the rice fields, sunlight flashing off its patchwork skin. The villagers below stop and watch. They've seen nothing fly here in months, not since the bombers came. For 12 minutes, the illegal fighter circles over Nagano. The engine holds. The controls respond. Against every rule of reason, it flies straight and true. Then, slowly, it descends. Takeda brings it down rough but alive. The landing gear bends, one wing scrapes the mud, but the craft stays upright. The engine sputters once more and dies. Silence. Then a sound no one expected. Laughter. Nakagawa walks toward the plane, eyes wet, hand trembling as he touches the fuselage. "It worked," he whispers. "It actually worked." No headlines, no witnesses beyond a few farmers and factory boys, no photographs. Just a single plane built from scraps that refused to die before its maker did. It was the last flight of Imperial Japan, not an act of war, but an act of proof. Because when the empire was gone and every command had failed, one engineer had shown that ingenuity could still take off, even from the ashes. For most of the war, the world believed Japan's military industry was a machine, disciplined, synchronized, and guided by a single vision of perfection. Newspapers described the genius of the empire's engineers. Allied analysts drew diagrams of vast aircraft factories operating with clockwork precision. The myth of total unity, of a nation thinking and building as one, became part of Japan's aura of fear. But beneath that image was chaos. By 1944, Japan's war production was not a single engine of innovation. It was 1,000 small workshops, fighting each other for scraps of material and for the right to exist. The Imperial Army and Navy each ran their own research programs, each designing different fighters, engines, and weapons. And they refused to cooperate. The Army funded Nakajima and Kawasaki. The Navy funded Mitsubishi and Aichi. Each branch hoarded blueprints, sabotaged rival projects, and refused to share test results. That wasn't unity. It was bureaucratic civil war. Engineers often joked that the biggest enemy of innovation wasn't the Americans. It was paperwork. Every new design had to pass through endless approval committees in Tokyo, filled with officers who had never flown a plane, never built one, and didn't care to learn. If a project didn't come from a major contractor, it was ignored or forbidden. If it wasn't authorized by the general staff, it was illegal. That's what made Nakagawa's idea so dangerous. He wasn't part of a sanctioned bureau. He wasn't building for prestige. He was building because he refused to accept that Japan, a nation of engineers and craftsmen, had lost the ability to make something that worked. His dream wasn't new. Other rebels had tried. At Hitachi, engineers built experimental gliders from bamboo after aluminum ran out. At Kawanishi, a team designed an entire seaplane from wood, only for it to be destroyed in a bombing raid before approval. In one case, a group of university students built a working jet compressor in 1945, but the Army shut them down for unauthorized research. That was the paradox of wartime Japan, a nation that worshipped innovation but feared independence. Officially, only the central government could decide what was worth inventing. Unofficially, hundreds of engineers broke those rules daily, designing parts in secret, stealing materials, and fabricating in hidden workshops. The results were uneven, but the intent was heroic. The myth of centralized genius had blinded the world, and even Japan's own leaders, to how fragile their system really was. When the bombers came, that system collapsed instantly. The central factories, Nakajima's Ota plant, Mitsubishi's Nagoya works, were obliterated in weeks. The engineers who survived had nowhere to go. Tokyo ordered production dispersed. Build wherever you can, however you can. And so the empire's final inventions were born in barns, schools, and caves. Some were failures, planes that fell apart after takeoff. But others, like Nakagawa's prototype, were triumphs of willpower disguised as desperation. His defiance didn't come from pride. It came from exhaustion with a system that rewarded obedience and punished results. By 1945, Nakagawa had watched 3 of his projects canceled by bureaucrats who couldn't even pronounce their names. He'd seen test aircraft destroyed before flight, engines scrapped for copper, and apprentices arrested for misallocation of resources. He was done asking for permission. So when the Nakajima plant at Musashino was bombed in February, he took what remained, engine parts, blueprints, and a handful of workers, and disappeared into the countryside. Officially, he was missing. In reality, he was building the only thing the empire no longer had, a functioning airplane. He had no orders, no funding, no authority. Just a belief that even in collapse, Japan could still make something that could leave the ground. The irony was cruel. The only real example of Japanese unity in 1945 wasn't between the Army and Navy, or Tokyo and the provinces. It was between one man, a few loyal engineers, and a pile of scrap metal. While the empire dissolved into silence, their hammers kept ringing. The world would remember Japan for its machines of war, the Zeros, the Hayates, the Shidankais. But the most important machine was one that no one asked for, no one approved, and no one wanted built. It was illegal. It was handmade. It was wrong by every technical standard, and it flew anyway, because sometimes genius isn't a system, it's a rebellion. By 1944, Japan's aircraft industry had entered a kind of organized collapse. The factories still existed, the engineers still drew blueprints, but the math no longer worked. Every equation for power, weight, and production was being rewritten by reality. At the start of the war, Japan's aviation miracle seemed unstoppable. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the world's best naval fighter, light, fast, and graceful. The Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, called the Oscar, danced through the skies of Burma and the Philippines. The Empire's pilots believed they could outfly anyone. But by 1943, the tide was turning, and the numbers told the truth long before the generals did. American fighters, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and eventually the P-51 Mustang, began shredding Japan's old designs. The Zero, once untouchable, was now outdated. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no engine that could match Allied speed. Nakajima's engineers begged Tokyo for resources to build something new. They had designs, blueprints for faster, stronger fighters like the Kai-84 Hayate. But the Army's procurement board dragged its feet. They wanted perfection. Japan needed production. It got neither. Then the bombers came. In November 1944, B-29s from the Mariana Islands appeared over Tokyo for the first time. Each could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, enough to erase a factory in minutes. Nakajima's Musashino and Ota plants, the beating heart of Japan's aviation network, were hit repeatedly. Photographs taken by American reconnaissance showed square miles of twisted wreckage. In one raid, 60% of the Musashino complex was destroyed. Engine production dropped from 2,000 per month to under 200. Japan's aluminum supply collapsed. The empire had lost access to Southeast Asia's bauxite mines. Imports from China dried up. Desperate engineers melted down cooking pots, bicycle frames, even bomb fragments to cast new parts. Nakagawa, then a mid-level designer at Nakajima, watched the walls close in. Every day brought new shortages: rivets, bearings, electrical wire. The power grid itself failed under bombardment. By early 1945, he and his team were drafting aircraft on the backs of ration paper by candlelight. Official memos still spoke in illusions: maintain production levels, prioritize essential programs. But everyone knew the war industry was dying. The Imperial government responded with denial disguised as control. In February 1945, the Army ordered all remaining aircraft development centralized under strict supervision. No new designs without authorization. No prototypes outside official channels. No field modifications. The problem was, there were no official channels left. The central factories were rubble. The supervisors were dead or displaced. The bureaucracy was alive only on paper. So, like a dying organism, Japan's aircraft industry decentralized itself. Engineers fled the cities and set up Kojo Inaka, rural workshops. They built wherever the bombs couldn't reach: barns, caves, temples, abandoned schools. Production didn't stop, it fractured. The numbers were staggering. Over 600 shadow factories appeared by mid-1945, scattered across Honshu and Kyushu. They built sub-assemblies, components, and sometimes entire planes, by hand. But without standardization, chaos ruled. One factory's wing didn't fit another's fuselage. Bolts were different sizes. Engines were untested. Japan's war industry had become a museum of improvisation. For Nakagawa, it was agony. He'd spent years designing with precision, the ideal mix of aerodynamics, efficiency, and reliability. Now he was asked to make something that flies with whatever you have. And what he had was rubble. He saw it firsthand when visiting the Nakajima branch plant near Ueda. The roof was gone, the machines wrecked. But in one corner, young mechanics were trying to rebuild a trainer aircraft from damaged frames. They were using hammers, hand drills, and scraps of aluminum. It shouldn't have worked. But it did. That sight changed him. Nakagawa realized that if Japan could no longer build modern fighters, it could still build functional ones: light, simple, repairable, and fast enough to defend what remained. He called it the people's plane, something that small factories could produce without heavy tooling, using recycled parts. But that idea went directly against the Imperial Command's obsession with control. Tokyo wanted big solutions: jets, rockets, miracle weapons. Nakagawa wanted the opposite: simplicity, independence, survival. He proposed his concept quietly to his superiors. They rejected it instantly. Unauthorized deviation from standard design protocols. That was the moment he broke. When Musashino fell to another raid, he gathered what was left: blueprints, tools, and a handful of loyal workers, and left for the countryside. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Weeks later, he sent one message through an old colleague: "We will build something that flies, not for the war, for the engineers." It was more than rebellion. It was resurrection. While Tokyo fell into ruin, a handful of men in the mountains began building a plane with no serial number, no approval, and no future, just to prove that Japan's ingenuity hadn't died with its empire. That's how Nakagawa's illegal fighter was born, not from orders but from refusal. Because sometimes, when the system collapses, only defiance keeps the machines running. By the spring of 1945, Japan's aircraft industry wasn't just in decline, it was in free fall. Every factory report read like a death certificate written in numbers. The nation that once boasted of the wings of the emperor was now melting saucepans to cast pistons and wiring planes with copper stripped from home appliances. The math of collapse was brutal and simple. In 1942, Japan produced 28,000 aircraft. In 1943, it managed 16,700. By 1945, barely 2,700. That's a 90% drop in 2 years. Not because of lost talent, but because the empire had run out of inputs. Each aircraft required 5 tons of aluminum, 400 gallons of high-octane fuel for testing 3 miles of copper wiring, 30 precision instruments from Germany or Manchuria. By 1945, Japan had none of them. The aluminum that once flowed from mines in Southeast Asia was gone. Imports from China had ceased. The United States Navy had strangled every sea route. In desperation, Japan created the Aluminum Recovery Bureau. Its orders: strip down everything metal that wasn't a weapon. Temple bells, window frames, pots, pans, all confiscated and melted. School children collected shrapnel. Housewives turned in cooking utensils. One propaganda poster read, "Turn your rice pot into a Zero's wing." But the smelters didn't care about slogans. Recycled aluminum was brittle, impure, and prone to cracking under stress. Planes built from it often failed on takeoff. Nakagawa, who'd once overseen high-grade alloy testing, saw it firsthand. His teams began receiving batches of aluminum that sparked when welded, contaminated with magnesium and iron. It was barely usable. Fuel was worse. A modern fighter engine, like the Nakajima Ha-45, which powered the Kia 84, required 100-octane aviation gasoline. Japan could barely produce 70-octane. The difference wasn't academic. It meant engines overheated, underperformed, and tore themselves apart mid-flight. Nakagawa called it engineering suicide. He wrote in his notes, "We build planes that can fly once. The second flight is a prayer." The airfields echoed that truth. Pilots climbed into machines they didn't trust, fueled with gasoline that smelled of paint thinner, their propellers carved from wood because metal was gone. Out of 100 aircraft produced in early 1945, only 40 reached operational service. The rest broke, burned, or crashed during testing. Still, Tokyo demanded miracles. The Imperial General Staff issued new orders. Develop a new interceptor to fight the B-29, faster, higher, stronger, despite the fact that Japan had no fuel, no metal, and no functioning factories. Nakagawa called the request a dream written in smoke. Every engineer knew the truth. The empire was dying by arithmetic. At Nakajima's remnants in Ueda, the daily work log told the story in stark lines. March 3rd, 2,400 pounds of aluminum requested, 120 delivered. March 15th, 8 engines scheduled, 1 completed. April 2nd, production halted. That was the end of official aviation in Japan. And yet, in the ruins, men like Nakagawa refused to stop. They didn't care about orders or quotas anymore. They cared about continuity. The idea that even if the nation vanished, the craft of flight should survive. Nakagawa gathered a handful of apprentices, men in their 20s who'd seen their cities bombed, their homes destroyed. Together, they began raiding scrapyards. They stripped wrecked Ki-43s for wings, took landing gear from burned-out trainers, and scavenged instrument panels from crash sites. Their workshop inventory read like a scavenger's diary. 4 partial fuselage frames, salvaged. 2 serviceable engines, 1 damaged. 1 wooden propeller, hand-carved. 600 pounds of scrap metal from wreckage. That was all. But Nakagawa didn't see wreckage. He saw parts waiting to be rearranged. He drew a new blueprint. Small, light, minimal. A fighter that could fly with half the material and a third the fuel of a standard design. He used steel tubing instead of aluminum spars, reshaped control surfaces for lift efficiency, and simplified the engine cowling to fit multiple engine types. He named it the KX Fighter, K for his initials, X for experiment, unofficial, unsanctioned, unstoppable. The logic was pure wartime physics. Reduce drag, reduce weight, recycle everything. He didn't have rivet guns, so they used hammers. He didn't have casting molds, so they used sand pits. When bearings ran out, they filed washers by hand. One worker later recalled, "We didn't build an airplane. We built a memory that refused to die." The result wasn't beautiful, but it was aerodynamic enough to stand a chance. Nakagawa's calculations estimated a top speed of 280 miles per hour and a climb rate rivaling early zeros. The Imperial authorities would have called it primitive. Nakagawa called it possible. He knew the empire was lost, but he wanted Japan to remember what it felt like to build something that worked. And that conviction, that math-defying defiance, made the illegal fighter more than an airplane. It became a message that when perfection is no longer possible, persistence is the only victory left. By July, the plane was nearly complete. It lacked paint, serial numbers, and approval. But it had a purpose: to prove that Japan's engineers could still make the impossible fly, even when the numbers said they shouldn't. And in a world running out of everything, that belief was worth more than any order from Tokyo. Because when the math of starvation takes everything away, ingenuity is the only thing that still multiplies. In the shadow of the Japanese Alps, hidden among pine forests and rice paddies, there stood a crumbling railway warehouse. The roof sagged under bomb fragments. The walls were patched with tin. But to a handful of desperate men, it was a cathedral. This was Nakagawa's secret workshop, the place where Japan's last fighter would be born. There were no guards, no insignia, no official papers, just a dozen engineers, machinists, and apprentices working under the constant threat of discovery. By Imperial law, what they were doing was treason. Unauthorized use of military materials was punishable by death. But by 1945, the law meant nothing. Tokyo was a rumor. Survival was the only authority left. The team called themselves the Night Mechanics. They worked in silence, hammering by candlelight after curfew. When American bombers passed overhead, they doused the lanterns and waited in the dark, listening to the distant thunder of explosions. The materials were as fragile as their morale. Aluminum came from wrecked Ki-43 fuselages. Engine mounts were scavenged from a burned Ki-84. The propeller was hand-carved from laminated birch polished with cooking oil. Every bolt had a story. The cockpit canopy had once belonged to a trainer aircraft that crashed in 1943. The seat was made from an oil drum. The instrument dials were stitched together from 3 different models, none calibrated correctly. It shouldn't have worked. But it was all they had. Nakagawa slept on the floor beside the airframe. Blueprint papers for blankets. He'd spend hours calculating structural stresses with a slide rule and chalk, then recheck the numbers when the wind howled through the walls. He wasn't chasing victory. He was chasing proof that even in defeat, Japan's engineers could still create. His young apprentice, Junpei Sato, later said, "He spoke like a man already dead, trying to leave behind a soul in metal." Every morning they rolled the half-built fuselage into sunlight, tested balance and adjusted by instinct. There were no wind tunnels, no test rigs, no spare parts. When something broke, they rebuilt it with whatever they could find. It was craftsmanship at the edge of collapse. One day, Nakagawa stood beside the unfinished wing and asked, almost to himself, if Tokyo had trusted its engineers instead of its officers, would the war have gone differently? No one answered. They didn't need to. The proof was right there. A machine assembled from wreckage, built in secret, that was somehow whole. By July, the fighter, the KX-3 as they nicknamed it, was complete. Its skin was rough, the seams uneven, but it had balance. Its empty weight, 1,800 kilograms. Engine, salvaged Ha-45, partially rebuilt, outputting 1,400 horsepower, though only on paper. It didn't matter. They'd built a plane from nothing. The first test was scheduled for the evening of July 28, 1945. They towed the craft out of the shed, across a dirt path toward a flattened rice field that served as a makeshift runway. The engine didn't start the first time, or the second. On the third try, it roared to life, coughing, sputtering, then stabilizing. The men cheered softly. For the first time in months, they'd heard the sound of something humanly built that wasn't destruction. Nakagawa inspected every joint by touch. His hands were black with oil. "If this fails," he said quietly, "let it fail while trying." The test pilot, Lieutenant Masaru Takeda, climbed into the cockpit. The canopy didn't close properly. They tied it down with wire. No wind, no orders, no witnesses. The night mechanic stood back. Takeda throttled up. The nose dipped, the propeller blurred. The sound of power filled the valley. He released the brakes. The plane rolled, wobbled, almost veered off course, then steadied. The tail lifted. Dust sprayed behind it. Nakagawa's heart pounded so loud he could feel it in his throat. Then, after 50 meters of struggle, the wheels left the ground. The KX-3 climbed, slow but steady, leaving a trail of smoke. It wasn't graceful, it was survival given wings. It circled once, twice. The sound filled the valley. Farmers stopped working and stared. A boy dropped his bucket and pointed upward, shouting, "It flies! It flies!" After 12 minutes, the engine coughed again. Fuel mixture too rich. Takeda brought it down roughly, and a short landing, the left wheel collapsing on impact. The airframe skidded, mud spraying, but it didn't break apart. The mechanics ran toward the wreck, shouting his name. The canopy opened. Takeda laughed. Exhausted, trembling, alive. Nakagawa reached the plane, placed his hand on the bent wing, and whispered, "It lived." In that moment, no one thought about the empire, the war, or the surrender they all knew was coming. They thought only of this, that from the ashes of defeat, a handful of men had built something that flew. The night mechanics covered the damaged fighter with straw mats to hide it from inspectors. Then they sat together in silence as the sun set over the mountains, the smell of oil and rain mixing in the air. For one day, they had won. Not a battle, but a memory. And for Nakagawa, that was enough. Because the last victory of Japanese engineering wasn't measured in speed or altitude. It was measured in defiance. Even as Nakagawa's prototype sat hidden under straw and silence, Tokyo's bureaucracy still believed it could command order from chaos. The empire's collapse was mathematical, but its leaders were still pretending it could be reversed through paperwork. In the final months of the war, the Imperial General Staff issued daily directives to factories that no longer existed. Orders for aircraft production were sent to plants that had been bombed flat weeks earlier. Requests for fuel went unanswered, because there was none. But the orders kept coming, written, stamped, and delivered to ghosts. The Imperial Army's Procurement Bureau demanded reports. Number of fighters completed this month. Nakagawa's old office at Nakajima responded with the truth. 0. The response came back. Unacceptable. Increase production by 15%. It was theater, bureaucracy performing for itself as the country disintegrated. While Tokyo's officers were writing memos, Nakagawa and his team were cutting scrap metal by hand, turning ration cans into oil filters, and hammering broken bolts straight again. The empire still claimed control over its engineers, but control had become an illusion. Every real act of creation now happened illegally. In the spring of 1945, an army inspector visited a small foundry near Ueda and discovered an unauthorized project, a prototype trainer made of plywood and steel. Instead of praising the ingenuity, he shut it down for improper authorization. That same month, Nakagawa's secret workshop was quietly reported by a neighbor to a local constable, a farmer who doubled as a wartime policeman. The constable came to investigate, saw the half-finished fuselage, and asked one question: "Is this for the military?" Nakagawa replied, "It's for Japan." The man hesitated, then nodded and walked away. He never filed a report. That's how far the empire had fallen. Local policemen ignored the law because they'd lost faith in it. The collapse of Japanese aviation wasn't just industrial, it was philosophical. The Imperial system had always believed that obedience could substitute for creativity, that hierarchy could replace talent. But by 1945, obedience had built nothing but ruins. The engineers who still had the will to create had to break the very system they'd once sworn to serve. Nakagawa knew this. He'd spent a decade watching innovation strangled by red tape. The obsession with approval stamps, the endless committees, the blind reverence for seniority. Now, as he built his illegal fighter from scrap, he felt liberated. For the first time, there were no officers, no signatures, no slogans, only engineers, tools, and the question, will it fly? He called it the freedom of failure. Failure in wartime Japan had been forbidden. To fail was to dishonor the emperor. But in the ruins, failure was the only teacher left. The irony was bitter. The empire that once demanded perfection now survived on imperfection. Bent metal, misfit parts, and recycled debris. The KX-3 itself was a mathematical rebellion. Nakagawa's design rejected the empire's obsession with complexity. Where official aircraft used 12,000 rivets, his used 4,000. Where others required precision alloys, his used mixed scrap. Where others needed a factory, his needed only hands. It wasn't elegant, but it was buildable. Tokyo didn't understand what that meant. They still believed in the illusion of scale, that central authority could conjure production through slogans. But Nakagawa believed in adaptation. He told his apprentices, "The empire will lose this war because it cannot learn from failure. But engineers must." His logic was cruel and beautiful. Systems fail when they cannot decentralize. Japan's engineers were discovering this too late. But they were discovering it nonetheless. By mid-August, even the army began to sense that something had shifted. Reports came in of unauthorized village factories across Honshu, producing replacement parts for vehicles and aircraft without orders. Instead of punishing them, regional officers began quietly helping, smuggling fuel, delivering tools, and pretending ignorance. It was rebellion by inertia. The system stopped fighting its own people and simply looked away. The line between law and survival blurred completely. When Nakagawa's prototype flew, no one reported it. But word spread anyway, from farmer to mechanic, from apprentice to airman. Whispers of the mountain plain reached even the remnants of the Nakajima network. Some dismissed it as a rumor. Others called it treason. But among the engineers who still dreamed, it became a symbol. If one illegal plane could fly, then Japan's spirit of creation wasn't dead, only hidden. And that terrified the bureaucrats more than the bombers ever did. Because the empire could control factories, but not faith. It could issue orders, but not inspiration. The real victory of the KX-3 wasn't in the air. It was in the minds of the men who built it. Proof that creativity survives even when nations don't. When Tokyo finally learned of Nakagawa's project, days before the surrender, the report reached an empty desk. The war was over before anyone could punish him. The empire had collapsed faster than its own paperwork. And in that collapse, the engineers were finally free. Free to fail, free to create, free to build again. The plane that shouldn't have existed had outlasted the system that forbade it. That's the cruelest kind of victory, when rebellion becomes the only functioning part of a dying machine. August 10th, 1945. The day after Nagasaki. The air above Japan was still thick with the smell of burned cities and surrender rumors. The emperor hadn't spoken yet. The radio called for patience and perseverance. But in the valley outside Nagano, there was no patience left. There was only one thing left to prove. The dawn came misty and blue. Dew clung to the grass of the makeshift runway, a former rice field leveled by hand. Nakagawa and his night mechanics had spent the night tightening bolts and checking seams by lantern light. The plane sat in silence, its patched skin catching the first rays of sun. The KX-3, Japan's last fighter, wasn't beautiful. Its fuselage was crooked. The paint was gone, replaced by raw aluminum patched with dull steel. The tail bore no markings, no Hinomaru. It wasn't flying for the emperor. It was flying for the engineers. The team gathered around. Their faces were hollow from hunger, their hands black from oil. None of them knew whether the plane would fly or whether this test would end in a crater. Nakagawa looked to his pilot, Lieutenant Masaru Takeda, 22 years old, barely trained, but brave in the quiet, mechanical way that only engineers respect. He climbed into the cockpit, checked the throttle, and nodded. There was no ceremony, no flag, no order. Nakagawa shouted one word over the engine noise. "Ike! Go!" The propeller spun. The old Hay-45 engine coughed twice, belched smoke, then caught. The valley shook with the sound of rebirth. The plane rolled forward. The wheels sank slightly in the mud, throwing up dirt and spray. For a moment it looked like it wouldn't make it. Then the tail lifted. The nose pointed skyward. And somehow, against math, against reason, against history, it flew. The mechanics erupted in cheers that turned to gasps as the craft wobbled, nearly stalling. Takeda corrected with quick instinct, leveling out at barely 100 meters. The KX-3's patched skin flashed silver as it banked over the mountains. It wasn't fast, but it was alive. Nakagawa stood frozen, his fists clenched, eyes fixed on the dot in the sky. He had built aircraft for the Empire for 10 years, each a product of orders and hierarchy. This was the first built from freedom. Down below, villagers gathered on the road, staring upward. Many had never seen a Japanese plane flying since the bombings began. To them, it wasn't a weapon. It was a ghost, a relic of a vanished dream. The plane circled once, twice. The sound of the engine echoed off the valley walls like a heartbeat. Inside the cockpit, Takeda fought vibration and misfiring cylinders. The oil temperature climbed past safe limits. The fuel line rattled. He held on for as long as he could, the controls trembling in his hands. Then he saw the oil pressure drop. He turned back. Nakagawa saw it immediately. The smoke trail, thin but dark. He ran out onto the field, shouting over the roar. The engine sputtered. The plane descended, steady but too fast. Takeda pulled up at the last second, hitting the ground hard. The landing gear folded. The left wing dug into the earth. The airframe spun once and stopped in a cloud of dust and steam. Silence. Then the canopy opened. Takeda raised a fist, grinning through blood and soot. "It flies!" he shouted. "It flies!" The mechanics laughed, cried, screamed. They ran to the wreck, pulling him free, slapping the fuselage like a living thing. Nakagawa approached slowly. His hands trembled as he touched the battered skin. The metal was warm. The machine was broken but intact. 12 minutes. That's how long it had stayed in the air. 12 minutes of stolen defiance. He looked around at his crew, the last engineers of a dying nation, and said quietly, "This is what Japan was meant to build." Not weapons, not suicide machines, but possibility. They towed the damaged aircraft back into the shed and covered it again with straw mats. That night, the radio announced the Emperor's decision to end the war. No one spoke. They sat in the dark, listening to the static, surrounded by the smell of oil and burnt metal. The Empire had ended. But in the corner of a hidden valley, something else had been born. An aircraft that should never have existed. A machine built from memory and refusal. It hadn't changed the war, but it had changed the men who built it. Because while the Empire died with obedience, they had found life in defiance. Nakagawa didn't sleep that night. He walked to the airframe, placed his hand on the wing, and whispered, "You were not made to fight. You were made to prove we could still build." He didn't know that within weeks, American occupation troops would arrive, searching for forbidden weapons. He didn't know they would soon discover the secret plane and marvel that it had flown. But for that single day, he didn't care. For 12 minutes, Japan's last airplane had turned defeat into proof. And for an engineer, proof is everything. August 17th, 1945. 2 days after the Emperor's voice filled Japan with silence. In cities and mountains alike, people still didn't know what peace meant. Soldiers wept, civilians bowed, officers burned their swords. But in the quiet valleys of Nagano, an old engine still sat warm. The war was over. Yet Nakagawa's workshop still smelled of grease and determination. The night mechanics had stopped building, but they couldn't stop fixing. The damaged KX-3 sat half-buried under straw and canvas, its fuselage bent, its propeller cracked from the landing. Still, Nakagawa refused to dismantle it. When one of his apprentices suggested burying the plane to hide it from occupation patrols, he shook his head. "We built it to fly," he said, "not to hide." But survival meant invisibility now. Days later, a new kind of army came down the road. American trucks, jeeps, and MPs with white helmets and cameras. The U.S. occupation had arrived. Orders spread across Japan. Surrender all weapons, aircraft, and technical material. Every prototype was to be destroyed. Every experiment erased. For Nakagawa, that meant execution. Not of a man, but of an idea. He worked quickly. The team dismantled the propeller and buried it behind the hangar. The engine was drained of oil and covered in tarps. The fuselage was disguised with straw mats and crates of rice. The runway was plowed back into farmland. By the time American officers arrived in the area, the plane that shouldn't exist had vanished into the landscape. But even buried, it wasn't silent. Nakagawa's notebooks, over 200 pages of hand-drawn schematics, fuel calculations, and aerodynamic notes, were hidden in bamboo tubes and buried beneath the floorboards of his workshop. He wrote in coded shorthand, blending engineering terms with poetry, so no one could accuse him of espionage. He called the file, "The Memory That Flew Once." When the Americans arrived, they asked questions through translators. Had he built any aircraft? Were there prototypes nearby? Nakagawa bowed politely. "All our planes were destroyed by the bombings," he said. The officer nodded and moved on. The war had given the victors too many ruins to count. Weeks passed. The valley went quiet again. But the hidden aircraft began to attract rumors. Farmers whispered about a plane in the mountains that flew after the surrender. Children claimed they'd seen it rise from the fields. It became a local legend, part pride, part ghost story. Nakagawa didn't correct them. He simply kept tending the wreck like a priest guarding a shrine. Until one morning in early 1946, a U.S. engineering team from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, TAIU, arrived in Nagano, following up on reports of hidden aircraft. They were led by Major James P. Hall, a former Lockheed test engineer, curious about what Japan had left behind. They found Nakagawa's shed by accident. What they saw inside left them stunned. The KX-3 sat under a tarp, its patched skin dull, its propeller half buried. Major Hall walked around it twice, touching the uneven rivets, the mismatched panels. "You built this?" he asked through a translator. Nakagawa hesitated, then nodded. Hall stepped closer, eyes scanning the welds. "Out of what?" "Everything we had," Nakagawa replied. Hall looked at the engine, a Ha-45, heavily modified with salvaged valves and tubing. He whistled. "This shouldn't work," he said. But it did. The Americans couldn't believe that a functioning aircraft had been built with no factory, no tools, and no approval. They measured it, photographed it, even offered to ship it to Yokohama for study. Nakagawa refused. "It stays here," he said softly. Hall didn't argue. He understood. Engineers recognize each other across languages. Before leaving, Hall wrote one note in his field journal. "One small handmade fighter discovered near Nagano, flew 12 minutes, built from wreckage. Craftsmanship extraordinary, spirit beyond replication." That entry, filed away in an archive in Tokyo, would become the only official record of Nakagawa's rebellion. After the Americans left, the KX-3 was quietly dismantled and burned under Allied supervision months later, as part of the nationwide demilitarization program. Nakagawa wasn't present. He'd already gone back to teaching, quietly, humbly, at a small technical school in Nagano. But his students noticed something strange about him. He never spoke of the war, never of defeat. But when he taught them about design, he always said the same thing. An engineer's duty is not obedience, it is continuity. The buried blueprints were never found. Yet years later, when Japan's new industrial age began under U.S. supervision, many of Nakagawa's students entered the companies that would define post-war Japan: Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Kawasaki, and Honda Aircraft. They carried his philosophy like a hidden circuit: simplicity, repairability, endurance. The KX-3 had died, but its principles survived, reborn in machines of peace. In 1954, Japan's first post-war aircraft, the Yokosuka T-1 trainer, flew for the first time. Its designers credited unnamed wartime engineers who believed flight should never end. When a photograph of the T-1 appeared in the newspaper, Nakagawa, now gray and frail, smiled. "We are still flying," he whispered. The engine of his youth, built illegally, buried under straw and burned to ash, had never truly stopped. Because an idea, once airborne, doesn't need permission to keep flying. By the time the ashes of the KX-3 cooled, the empire it was built to outlive was gone. Yet Nakagawa's rebellion had already accomplished what no army could. It had proven that ingenuity could survive even inside defeat. When American officers filed their reports, they didn't see the myth. They saw data. Notes on lift-to-drag ratio, improvised fuel mix, metal fatigue. But they missed the meaning, that this broken little fighter represented the rebirth of Japan's real strength, its engineers. The empire's leaders had spent 15 years worshipping machines as weapons. Nakagawa and his crew had built one as a testament. They weren't trying to win the war. They were trying to prove that their craft still mattered. That's what makes the KX-3 so extraordinary. It was a machine born of pure function. No ideology, no politics, no glory. It was simply the result of necessity meeting imagination. When you strip away the slogans and flags, that's all engineering really is: the refusal to accept that something can't be done. The irony is painful. The same government that once punished unauthorized innovation would later base its economic resurrection on it. Within a decade, Japan's factories were producing the world's best civilian engines, electronics, and vehicles, each designed with the same philosophy Nakagawa had whispered to his apprentices: simplicity is speed, repairability is victory. The KX-3 had been crude, but its design language predicted everything that came after: modular construction, interchangeable parts, lightweight composites, concepts that became standard across Japan's post-war industries. And yet, history forgot his name. There was no medal, No statue, no museum exhibit. The man who had built Japan's last fighter from scrap metal died quietly in 1962, working on agricultural engines in Nagano. His students scattered across the factories of the new Japan, carrying his words but not his story. The official histories of the war mentioned the famous aircraft, the Zero, the Hayate, the Shidenkai. None mentioned the mountain plane. But for the engineers who knew, the lesson was clear. The KX-3 wasn't about flight. It was about resistance. Resistance against bureaucracy, against fatalism, against the idea that creativity needs permission. When Japan surrendered, its war factories went silent. But 1,000 workshops like Nakagawa's didn't disappear. They adapted. Those mechanics became the seedbed for post-war industry. Men who once riveted wings now assembled radios. The same hands that carved propellers built the first transistor housings. That transition from empire to innovation didn't happen in government offices. It happened in barns and sheds, in secret workshops where engineers refused to stop creating. That was Nakagawa's true legacy. He turned defiance into design. The KX-3 wasn't a weapon of war. It was an act of civilizational memory. Proof that craftsmanship can exist even when civilization collapses. The Americans who saw it understood that instinctively. Major Hall wrote in his debrief, "This aircraft could not have been authorized. It exists only because someone refused to stop working." That sentence became a quiet prophecy. Within 10 years, Japan's new engineers would rebuild an entire nation on that same refusal. To stop, to give up, to obey decline. The math of war had destroyed the empire. But the ethos of creation, the belief that building is a moral act, had survived in one patched-together airplane. That's the paradox of the KX-3. It was born in a time when Japan could make nothing, and yet it made everything possible. It showed that in the ruins of control, freedom becomes the last functioning material. And that, in the end, is the principle Nakagawa proved. You can bomb the factories, silence the orders, erase the flags, but you can't kill the instinct to build. Because a nation isn't measured by its victories. It's measured by what it creates when it has nothing left. The KX-3 never fought a battle. It never carried a weapon. It barely flew. But it did something infinitely greater. It outlived the war. And for the men who watched it lift off that summer morning, tired, hungry, forgotten, it wasn't a fighter at all. It was proof that Japan could still make things fly. The war had ended, but Japan's engineers hadn't. The fires that had consumed the empire left behind not silence, but the faint hum of machines being rebuilt, radios, sewing motors, tiny generators, all whispering the same rhythm. We can still make things. Nakagawa's last fighter never appeared in textbooks, but his way of thinking spread quietly, invisibly, through every post-war workshop that rose from the ashes. When Japan was forbidden to build weapons, its engineers turned that restriction into innovation. The country that could no longer make warplanes made cameras, motorcycles, and transistor radios, all lighter, smaller, and more efficient than anything the world had seen. The same math that built the KX-3, minimal material, maximum function, became the blueprint for Japan's economic miracle. Mitsubishi went from producing Zeros to producing forklifts. Kawasaki went from bombers to bicycles. Nakajima Aircraft was reborn as Fuji Heavy Industries. And its descendants would one day build the Subaru. Every engine that started in post-war Japan carried a trace of that last illegal airplane. The courage to build without permission. The Americans had won the war, but Japan's engineers had won something deeper. The right to start over, this time with purpose instead of obedience. Nakagawa's philosophy, simplicity is survival, became a cultural instinct. By the 1960s, it defined everything from Toyota's assembly lines to Sony's transistor radios. In the ruins of defeat, Japan didn't rediscover pride through monuments or speeches. It found it in machines that worked, The KX-3 may have flown only 12 minutes, but its descendants still fly. In every aircraft Japan exports, every engine it builds, every innovation designed not for conquest, but for continuity. That's how civilizations rise again, not by victory, but by function. The empire had built the Zero as a symbol of perfection. Nakagawa built the KX-3 to prove a different kind of truth, that even broken, a nation that still knows how to build is never truly defeated. Because creativity isn't loyalty, it's survival. And survival is the most powerful rebellion there is.